What makes a good book? Oh, a good book is made by, I think, a relationship between a reader and a writer. Good books need readers to have trust and faith in the writer and be generous with a writer. It's a relationship. So it's interesting because if, as a reader, I think the good book has to do the work for me, it's a wrong attitude to take to reading. So a good book is made in a relationship. Oh, I think it has to be a very good story. I mean, I think young readers, while there have to be social issues, I think that you hope for young people to engage with. I think that you need to provide a good story that will hold a young reader's interest and attention. But for me, being a parent of 5 children, I would look and hope that when my children finish a book, they have enjoyed it, but it is also a book that has left them with ideas to consider and to think about. So in other words, it's a relationship, it's a teaching relationship, or again, it's an intellectual relationship. So those two things are absolutely vital. That's really interesting because I have several books that have been labelled and considered young adult. I certainly didn't write them with the purpose of them being young adult. So sometimes what we might call young adult in particular is a marketing exercise, it's a branding exercise. I think at the young adult level, there are many books that what we would call crossover texts where both a young adult and an adult should enjoy those books. So my book that has been at the festival this year, Blood, and I had an audience of YA young adult readers, that book is not considered a YA book in Australia, although it is read by young people. And my first book, Shadowboxing, was not written as a YA book, but it's taught very widely in upper high school, so it fits in that category. I think children's literature is a bit different. Once you go to a younger age, the way that books are produced, the way that stories are shaped, it's quite clear that those books are, there is a particular audience. Now obviously as a parent reading books to children, I have always been heartened when I read a children's book to my children and I'm actually interested in the book. Sometimes you're not so interested. So I think YA is the difficult one to define. Clearly I think the thing about YA, when people specifically write for that category, is of course they must have, or they tend to demand teenage or young adult protagonists, narrators. Now, I think that young adult readers often read books that have no teenage protagonists, and those books are probably not categorised as YA, but they have a very attractive readership amongst young people. Okay, the book I recommended for the festival was Out Stealing Horses by Per Pedersen, who's a Norwegian writer. It's a wonderful book. He is a writer who has a very gentle pace to his writing, engages very strongly with the human condition, with social and human issues. His books are different in the sense certainly than the way I would write. They are not plot-driven books, so they're not dramatic, they're very quiet. But I think that when you finish a book of his, there is so much to contemplate. So a lot of his books are about the clash between generations, younger generations of Europeans, particularly in regard to their parents and grandparents who have experiences of, say, World War II, the post-war situation in Europe. He is a writer that, when you're reading the book, it doesn't seem that dramatic. But when you finish the book, you are left thinking about the issues for many, many days. And I go back and read his work over and over again. His new book, in English, called I Refuse, when I read the last scene of that book, it was so evocative and so profound that I was thinking about it for weeks. So it lasts, the book lasts. Well, I think generally with younger readers, and if you're writing a YA book, it's how you might project political issues. You cannot, I may miss, but even as a writer, I think that the way you approach politics, you cannot approach it directly, because I think you will lose your readers, because I think younger people are not apathetic, but they're very disaffected by mainstream politics. So that if you want to engage people with social and political issues, you have to think of a way around terminology or language. So I don't as much think that it's what I miss, it's how you approach political issues, which is, I think, is important. I suppose that there are issues which I think some writers are a bit apprehensive about their own censorship. So with language, writing about sex, drugs, etc. In Australia, there's a very puritanical attitude to these issues, and it would be very unlikely that you could get a book put on, say, a schools list for reading by schools if you have a direct approach to, say, drug taking, sex, etc. Now, I don't particularly have a strong interest in those subject areas myself, but I think knowing my teenage children, they have more than a mature capacity to deal with those issues. So I think the way that we think that we're overprotecting children or we're keeping issues such as this away from our children is a really silly idea. Young people know how to discuss these issues and they want to be able to discuss them in relationship to text. So I would like to see more social issues present in YA novels and present in a very strong way, because I think it's the discussion we need to have. I write because most issues that I consider for any length of time, I eventually find that I want to reflect on those issues in writing. So I may write initially just a personal idea that I want to make some sense of the world. And then at some point I think that those ideas start to evolve into something bigger. So I'm very much interested in social issues such as homelessness. I'm interested in social issues such as marginalisation and disadvantage, and all of those issues are very strong in my work. So in the end I want to tell stories about those sort of people. There are other ways I express myself, so it could be in public discussion, in more what we might call academic writing, but in the end I think the way to get people to think about those issues is through storytelling. So storytelling to me is central to raising the issues that I think should be of wider concern to people in the community. Watching people, usually. I'm a great observer, so that I tend to, again when I'm walking, taking photographs, making notes in my journal. I will see something that interests me. Initially it's just a little spark of an idea, it's not a story. I write a note down for it and then I tend to find that there's something more that I want to do with it. So that at the moment I'm writing a new novel, and the whole novel is based on an original observation of watching a man light a candle in a church and then sit down and contemplate. He wasn't praying, or he didn't appear to be praying. So I was interested in what a lonely man, or seemingly a lonely man going to the church, who was he lighting the candle for? Why was he lighting the candle? Why did he sit in the church afterwards? So I started to develop an idea for a novel around a man who lives alone, who has no friends, but he has this past that I want to explore as a writer. So my ideas for writing, they start from those initial observations. I think that when they first talk, so that I do a lot of observational work again on what the character might look like. I'm very interested in how a character walks, how they dress, maybe something about their clothing, their hair, anything. But I always get anxious. I want to get to that first scene of dialogue. So when I get to write a line of dialogue where the character talks, that is the most interesting, because they're opening their mouth for the first time. You don't want to have just a single voice that is the same each time you write. So when I hear them speak or when I write those words, I'm very excited about coming to understand how they speak, what words they use. So that is the most intriguing, because I don't know that until I write that first line of dialogue. It comes as a surprise to me, and it's exciting. It's very exciting. The hardest thing about writing is when you do long work. I don't find writing short stories hard. It's very enjoyable. The material I produce for weather stations, I wrote usually very short, quickly, deliberately. I just wanted to write my thoughts down and publish them. when you write a novel, there's so much that you are trying to balance. So I have a lot of notes. All the time you're walking around between writing and the characters are in your head and it becomes quite scrambled. It's just hard work to write a novel for me. So I don't have the same enjoyment as I do when I write short story or an essay. But at the completion of a novel, the reward is better. So I've finished 2 novels now, and the satisfaction at the end of the process is amazing. But during the process of writing, there are some days when you hate writing. I never feel like that when I'm writing short story or essay, but sometimes you're writing a novel, you actually want to stop, you want to throw it away, you think it's terrible. So you go through all sorts of emotions. And for me, because I work full time and I have children, I'm also balancing those 3 things. So when I'm writing a novel, I never feel I have enough time to do what I want. So it's quite frustrating to be a novelist if you work as well. Typically Australian. It's interesting because I've never thought of my books as typically Australian, but often when they're reviewed in Australia, they'll say it's a very typical Australian voice. But I think what they mean is I'm dealing with characters on the margins, working class, poor people, Aboriginal people, who are not usually represented in novels or not represented in the centre of a novel. So if there's anything particularly Australian, it's dealing with parts of Australian culture that you don't read about that often. But I would say that, and I would hope, that the way that I deal with characters in my book is similar to the way that writers in Europe or North America would deal with similar characters. I suppose if there was anything typically Australian about my books, it's more the landscape. So that the places that I write about, the places I create, they have a very strong sense of Australia as what I would consider places that have a very difficult, we live in a very difficult environment, physical environment. We live in a country which has a lot of industrial ruin. So that a lot of the people that I write about, they live in places that are no longer viable in the sense that they're not shiny and new places. They're places around rivers that are derelict or factories or poorer homes. So I think that the typical aspect of my book that you could say this is about Australia that doesn't exist in the same way elsewhere would be around both natural landscapes and urban landscapes, which are very strongly identified with my country. And I'm regarded in Australia as someone who writes about the city of Melbourne very strongly. Oh, I think writers that inspire me for different reasons. So one of my favourite books is a book called Island by a Canadian writer, Alistair MacLeod. And I read his short stories because I call them a comfort read. So that on a winter's day when I feel like I want to sit and read in the window and look at the rain, I read his stories which are set on the east coast of Canada. They're very moody and evocative, so that's just for me to be selfishly enjoying a book. So he inspires me as a very strong literary writer. But I think that in Australia at the moment, a lot of young female writers would be my inspiration because teaching writing, I teach mostly young women in arts, in the humanities, and I found that in the last few years there have been a remarkable number of young Australian writers coming up, female writers, why they inspire me is it's much more difficult for women to be artists in Australia, and these women are really discussing the important social issues. So there are writers in Australia that I really admire, like Fayval Parrott, Maxine Beniber-Clark, Ellen Van Nerven, Melissa Lukashenko. All of these are women writers who I read and I teach their work as well. And it's important for young women who want to write to have their own role models. So rather than read old men like me, I want to get them to read young women who are writing very well, but are also there for these young women to emulate. So I can do this, or I can work at doing this because here are these women who have been successful. I think that my new book called Ghost River is in some ways not a take on Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, but it evokes that sort of mood in contemporary Melbourne. As a teenager, probably the romance of those type of characters was something I was very attracted to. And with the Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn characters, their misadventure, their lifestyle of laziness and being on the river was something that I was very interested in. And I would probably say at the time of reading, they were certainly the most effective literary characters for me to associate with. And even though I've moved on, at the time of reading Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the Tom Sawyer books, is that I absolutely felt an affinity with those characters. I wanted to be those characters. The other one would be Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird, the Harper Lee novel. And this is completely romanticized, and it doesn't bear any relationship to reality. I thought the Atticus Finch character in that book was such a strong father figure that I used to go to bed and imagine that he was my father. Now, I now realise that that is not the sort of thing that's going to get you anywhere, but it's amazing. I think the important issue here is, as a teenager, how a fictional world can become your world. You can go inside that fictional world and it's as if this is the world that I want to be in, this is the world that I want to be part of, because my real world doesn't work for me. So I came from a very dysfunctional, chaotic home as a boy, and there was something about that world that I thought this would give me safety and security. And I know that's a fantasy, but I think books often provide that escape and fantasy that we desire. Oh, I think an honest publisher. I think that publishers are very important, obviously, to writers, but my experience with publishers has been one that the relationship can change during the production of a book, and they have a particular motivation in mind which may not meet your motivation. So for me, a publisher that I enjoy working is a publisher that you have a very direct and open and honest relationship with. And on some occasions I've found that those relationships have not been as honest or open as I would like, and that does have a detrimental effect on how you work with the publishing company. So just someone who is direct with you. Clearly when you're working with a publisher editor, and often they're different people but they may be the same person, I think an editor in this position working in a publishing house is absolutely central, and that is a person who knows what you are trying to do with your work. And even if you're not doing it well enough, a good editor will say to you, I understand what you're trying to do here, you're not doing it well enough, this is what I would suggest you do. And that's fantastic. Those relationships are absolutely the most important when you're working with a publishing house and getting to a point of, you know, final manuscript, publishing the book and putting it out there. Oh, the audience. I think obviously at a literature festival you meet other writers, and most of those writers are wonderful. You know, some writers are more singular, but one of the things coming to a festival is you get to meet people who you would never have met. Most people are very generous, and particularly coming from Australia, people are very curious about where you've come from and what you're interested in. But at any literature festival, everything lives and dies on the audience and the generosity and engagement with the audience. So what I love, and what I love about the Berlin Festival, is that the time given over to discussion with the audience is very important, because in that discussion you're able to share ideas about a book beyond the book. And I found at this festival those discussions to be really invigorating and energetic. So for me that's the key, because when you present at a festival, there's a lot of energy required to do that, and you feel drained at some points, or you feel, you know, when the audience asks questions and they discuss, they re-energize you. So you leave a session feeling quite high or pumped up. If the audience doesn't become engaged, you leave it with an empty tank. So this has been a very good festival for the audience being central to the vibrancy of the festival. I'm a much more quiet and gentle person than people realise. So when I go to festivals, people say, come on, we'll go to the pub and we'll have a drink. Or, you know, they punch me in the arm or something. So they think I'm sort of macho. And maybe that comes across in my personality or possibly in my characters. But I don't drink alcohol. I don't want to punch anyone, and I'm a very quiet person.